very much. A packed audience, as it is every year for this report. Thinking about some kind of remarks I was going to make this morning, I was just thinking about really the last year in news. And there are moments in the world really that are made for journalism. And the last 12 months, probably no more so. I mean, who in this room, who was here last year, could have predicted the events that we've seen? The Brexit earthquake, Hillary Clinton's defeat and Trump's victory, the meltdown of the left-right political consensus in France, Cameron out, May in, the DUP in, the transformation of Jeremy Corbyn from fringe Islingtonian activist to zeitgeist figure, galvanizer of the young and star of the pyramid stage. Glastonbury, and of course alongside political disruption, major world events have played out. Terrorist atrocities in Europe, the start of the dismantling of ISIS, the ongoing bloodletting in Syria, headlines of imminent war with North Korea. At home, most recently, the ghastly catastrophe that was Grenfell Tower. All of these events require a well-funded news media. And the journalistic accounts will in the future, I suspect, show what we've witnessed over the last 12 months as some of the most significant events in recent history. And on top of all of that, we've been sent into the spin with the sudden phenomenon of fake news, played out in the US elections, but continuing to this day. What a year to be a journalist. But how has journalism risen to the occasion? How has it differentiated itself from the fake news shaping public attitudes? Is journalism more secure now than it was this time last year? Now, on the face of it, the findings from this year's Reuters Institute digital news report are perhaps more encouraging than past years. There's evidence that people are prepared to pay, at least for quality, either through subscriptions or donations. The threat of ad blockers seems to be receding, and there's a growing sense that people will pay for content that's valuable, convenient, and relevant. That means specifically when it comes to generating revenue, it's now not about reporting what's happened. There's widely available material for that that's for free. It's now all about answering the question, what does it mean? But are things really that rosy? The surge in paying for journalism in America hasn't happened here. Britons are either too mean or perhaps more charitably, they're happy with the quality of free journalism in this country. Only 3% of us here in the UK pay for news subscriptions. Now, what this report shows is that there are still significant risks remaining to the media. Trust has hit a low this year, driven, the report authors say, not by the actions of the news media, but by political polarisation. A third of the public are now actively avoiding the news because either they feel it represents the opposite of their political convictions or because the news itself depresses them. But perhaps the biggest long-term threat to the news media is a phenomenon that's difficult to see being rolled back, the inexorable weakening of the direct relationship between the creator and the consumer of journalism. This year, the power of the platforms has marched onwards. The Interactive Advertising Bureau finds Google and Facebook taking 90% of the growth in digital advertising revenue over the last year, with the remaining 10% fought over by everyone else. That's clearly not sustainable if we want to continue to have a sufficient plurality of media sources. Aggregators like Apple News and the messaging platforms are also breaking the bond between the news provider and the reader. And every day that bond is shaken by the pollution of news sources, by fakery and misbehaviour that's brought distrust to the mainstream media that we've seen reflected in the report. But while the gateway to journalism is now increasingly through the side door, it's important to remember that people are actually opening the door. In this country and in America, we've seen consumption of journalism on smartphone grow significantly over the last year, up almost 50% here. And those levels of demand can only be a good thing because as demand for news is growing, we now really need to turn to how we crack the nut for monetising news. And I think there's a lot of evidence in the report this year for how we might go about doing that. So with that, I'd like to ask Dr. David Levy to make some opening remarks, and then Nick Newman, the lead author of the report, is going to take you through the detail. Over to you, chaps.
Thanks very much, Ed, and thanks to all of you for coming along, and thanks very much to Edelman for hosting us here today. We're really delighted to be here, and we're going to be able to touch on some of the richness of the data today, but you will have seen there's copies of the report on your seats, and there's also, you can download more information from the dedicated website. As you know, this is the biggest ongoing survey of news, which is based on a survey done by YouGov of over 70,000 people in 36 countries and 5 continents. We've added 3 countries in Central and Southern America this year, Chile, Mexico and Argentina, 4 markets in Asia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore and Malaysia, and 3 in Europe, Croatia, Slovakia and Romania. I should say, as I do every year, that this is based on an online poll, so it's representative of those who are online, but not of national populations. As such, it would tend to underrepresent traditional news behaviour such as TV, print and radio whenever we talk about cross-platform behaviour. As I said, the polling is conducted by YouGov on our behalf, and you can see here that the samples for each country, each of the 36 countries, are about 2,000 per country, including the UK. We're really grateful for the support from a wide range of sponsors, ranging from the Thomson Reuters Foundation, who are the core sponsors of the Reuters Institute, to the many people involved in supporting this report. They include Google, the BBC, Edelman here, Ofcom, and a number of industry associations and universities around the world. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Nick, who's going to present the findings of the report. So, Nick.
Thanks very much, David. So really good to be here today to present our findings again, and I'm just going to talk about 4 key themes. So firstly, we find profound skepticism about both the news media and also about social media, and we'll explore some of that. As Ed's mentioned, there is also the question of whether public concern about fake and low-quality news is making journalism more or less valuable. On the platform issues, we found that counter to the prevailing echo chamber narratives, social media and search are actually exposing people to more sources of news than they would otherwise get. But on the other hand, they don't necessarily remember the brands. And finally, we're kind of getting to the next stage of the mobile revolution with the rise of messaging apps, and then even looking beyond that to the emergence of voice as perhaps the next disruptor. So starting with the so-called fake news, and we find across all countries pretty low trust in social media. Just 24% say it does a good job in separating fact from fiction, and in fact even lower in the UK. And these are just some of the comments from respondents on the issue. So it's a petri dish for ideological fake news. Others talk about their feeds being polluted by hyper-partisan or extreme content. People share, as this comment says, without reading the information in the article. So a frequent complaint we picked up on, and more than previously, is what people were telling us. On the other hand, there are people, 24%, who think that social media does a good job providing more authentic news, different perspectives that you won't get in the mainstream media, as we saw in the Grenfell fire, for example. So it's not a universal story. If we compare that, social media, to mainstream media, so same question, we find about twice as many people, so 40% across countries, think the news media does a good job in separating fact from fiction. So better, but not exactly a ringing endorsement. And for those people who think that, there is a perception it's what journalists do. It is their job to sift false information from correct, to bring credible reports. And that crucially, there is accountability. That there are bylines, editors, processes, that the reputation of the brand itself is at stake. And we detect that's something that could be emphasized and built on much more by the news industry going forward. If we look at the issue of trust more widely, this is a question we ask about trust in the news in general. We see huge variation, as you can see, across countries. So trust tends to be strongest on the left-hand side there. You can see Scandinavian countries, Finland at the top, 62%. And then right at the other end, you have South Korea and Greece, just 23%. So these are countries where the media is broadly not seen as credible, not seen as independent of business or political influence. It's worth noting that in the UK, we have seen a 7-point fall in trust since Brexit. So partly due, we argue, to the polarizing debate over the last year, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But in some countries, like the United States, we also see a really big difference between trust in the news in general, 38%, and trust in the sources you use. For example, 53%, so that might be Fox News on the right, or it might be Washington Post on the left. And this suggests to us, very high degrees of polarization in terms of media use in that particular market. So this year, we thought we would try and visualize what media polarization looks like in different countries. So we created a left-right spectrum. So based on what respondents told us about their political beliefs, are they extreme left, extreme right, etc., or in the middle? And then we looked at the usage of particular brands online. This is just online. And so this is the map for the US. So the size of the bubbles here represents the usage of those brands, remember, and then where they go depends on the proportion of each brand who are using them from left or right. And you can see here that from the user's perspective, there actually is a bunch of liberal media on the left there, sort of super serving, if you like, that audience. And then there's just one big media brand on the right. So that, of course, is Fox News. And the gap between those organizations, of course, has been a matter of much debate in the US. So people are, to an extent, living in different universes. And then on top of that, we've seen the rise of these hyper-partisan online media in the last few years, represented on this chart by Breitbart on the right and Occupy Democrats on the left. There are many more. But I think this picture really helps to explain the mistrust that you see in the United States right now, and much of which, of course, comes from the right, because they feel unrepresented. Here are a few comments. Fox News keeps it safe, keeps it fair. CNN tells us lies. They're so far to the left, they might fall off. And people who self-identify on the right are 3 times as likely to mistrust the media as those on the left. So let's compare that with a picture in the UK. And we find quite a different story. So what we see here is a very, very different spread. So quite a good spread, pretty well. The right is pretty well represented. And there's a range on the left too. I should put the names on there as well. And you can see this huge bubble in the middle is James's public service BBC, used by around 70% every week across radio, television, and online. So there is a brand or a number of brands who are giving people a more common set of facts in the UK, unlike the US. But last year, we've also seen in the UK the rise of hyperpartisan sites, distributed often via Facebook and social media. So the Canary is one on the left and Breitbart on the right, but much smaller, we should remember, than in the US. And since Brexit, we've also had this sort of increasingly polarized political debate, with the BBC increasingly in the firing line from both left and right, as these comments make clear. So that's the one from the right, and then from the left, the BBC is also attacked for supporting far-right parties nowadays. So I guess the point is there that it's much harder for media that tries to be balanced or tries to take a position in the middle in a very highly polarized political situation. Just one final point about trust, just sticking with the UK for a minute. In an online world, you often use multiple brands for different things, and you trust them for different things. So for the first time this year, we've asked about attributes of brands. So which is better for accurate and reliable news, which is better for helping me understand, which is better for strong opinions or amusing and entertaining content. And I've just picked out 3 from the UK, so BBC, Guardian, and BuzzFeed. And it's a complicated chart, but essentially what this is saying, you've got the attributes around the side there, but the one at the 70% on the left-hand side there of all users of the BBC News Online think that it is best for accurate and reliable news. Interestingly, only 21% of Guardian readers think it's best for accurate and reliable news, and just 2% of BuzzFeed News users. And that's, of course, partly because users of these brands are using these brands for different things. So they're using the BBC for, say a news on a terrorist attack, but turning to the Guardian or valuing the Guardian much more for opinion, for strong opinion, and BuzzFeed for amusing and entertaining content, despite the excellent investigations and other amazing journalism that Janine and her team have done over the last year. Brand perceptions, it seems, are very hard to change. So I think the takeaway from this is in an online world, people mix and match between brands, and it's increasingly important to be clear about what you stand for and which of these attributes you're really going to compete on. So one of the most interesting findings this year, I think, is the changing shape of the social media landscape. And on the surface, things are looking pretty similar. So on average, over half of us say we get news from social media. So 54% across countries, and you can see here continued growth in the US and the UK. So going back to 2013, twice as many people are using social media for news. As I've explained, there are different issues in each country. But elsewhere, in a large number of countries actually, we start to see a decline in the reported use of social media for news. These are just figures from some of the largest European countries. So this could be related to some of the trust issues that I've talked about. It could be changes to the algorithm that Facebook made last year, prioritizing friends and family a bit over professional news content. Or it could be the rise of messaging apps, or it could be probably a mix of all those things. If we look in detail by network, so this is the map we show every year of social networks on the left with figures for any usage. That's in the dark. So you can see here 70% of people are using Facebook for any purpose, 47% for news. Twitter actually is still reasonably strong at 10%. But then the main change is on the messaging side, where you have WhatsApp now used for 40% for any purpose across countries, 15% for news. Last year it was 8% with a smaller number of countries. So news is, and there's huge variation there as well. So in some countries, like Malaysia, where it can be dangerous to talk openly in open networks like Facebook, people are using WhatsApp. We've seen huge increases, 51%, 25% in Turkey, again, a country where it's difficult to use open networks. But here in the UK, just 5% and just 3% in the US. So it's very varied. Worth remembering, of course, Facebook owns WhatsApp as well as Instagram. So in total, 80% are touching a Facebook product every week, 54% for news. Another key and perhaps surprising finding around both social media and other distributed environments like search is that far from creating echo chambers, for most people, they help expose them to greater number of sources and a greater variety of sources too. So on average, people who use social media use over 4 sources of news weekly, compared with 3 sources for people who don't use social media, and the same for search. In fact, more so, as you're going through those search results, you're being exposed to, and you click on a greater variety of news. So that's good. But we also find that people don't necessarily, when they're in those distributed environments, remember the news brands that they find. So this is some research we did just in the UK this year, where we looked at people, what people were using through a YouGov tracking panel, and then we asked a proportion of them if they could remember the brand about 24 to 48 hours later. And for those who came directly, i.e. they'd been on another website, 81% could remember. For those coming from search, 37%, and those from social, 47%. So less than half essentially remembering the brand. So in an aggregated environment, it is often harder to pick out that brand. And this may have implications for business models built on using social media for marketing or for brand awareness. So moving on to mobile, and in general, we see a flattening of growth. So most people now have a smartphone. But I think the intensity with which they're using these devices and our dependence continues to grow. So just one illustration of that. 46% of smartphone users, you're probably amongst them, use your smartphone to access news in bed. 32% in the bathroom or the toilet. That's more in some countries than others. I'm not going to reveal which ones. Use in the home is now greater than when out and about or commuting to work. So the point is there's still lots of computers and laptops in the home, but people aren't picking them up as much because the smartphone has become so good at so many things. And as a consequence of that, the importance of news apps is growing again. Mobile alerts and the importance of the lock screen as a key discovery mechanism is going to increase. And then in terms of new devices, it's still very early days, but it is interesting to see the speed with which voice-activated speakers like the Amazon Echo are taking off compared with smartwatches, which have been around for a long time. So these devices have been on the market for a year or so in most countries, or much less than that, already have a healthy level of penetration, and half of those users in the US are using those devices for news. So it looks like voice could be a significant new factor, and of course in Amazon, another new platform player for the news industry to deal with. So finally, the business issues. To what extent do worries about fake news and biased news feed through to increased willingness to pay? So the answer is that we have seen a significant change in the United States. So the percentage paying for some kind of online news in the last year has risen 7 percentage points, so 9 to 16%. And what's interesting is that much of that increase has been driven by the young, by under 35s. and by those on the political left. So of all those people paying, 29% say that the reason they're doing so is to help journalism. That's a much higher figure than the all-country average of 13%. And of course, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, who are in the room, have been gleefully reporting the increases in the number of paying subscribers. On the other hand, more generally, we don't see such change. So slight increases in some countries, but broadly the same. So only a minority is paying. On average, 13% pay for online news. And that's highest in affluent Scandinavia, where you have small markets, strong reading traditions, strong brands, but also a place actually where they're using data and technology in a very smart way to get new subscribers and to upsell existing ones. And you can see lowest in the UK and Greece, where relatively few providers even try to charge for news. In focus groups this year, there were some hopeful signs, as Ed's mentioned already. A number of the people we talked to say that they would be prepared to pay, but they recognized they probably would have to pay in the future, in fact, but they're not going to pay when so much is free. So they talked about the need for a concerted effort. So lots to talk about, lots of issues there, hopefully. Pay, trust, platforms, lots to pick up on. Thank you very much.
We obviously need a kind of British Donald Trump to kickstart a subscription culture in this country. Anyway, listen, reaction. Rena Kaplan is to my left. She is head of audience engagement at the Financial Times, where she leads a team that helps grow the reach and impact of FT journalism around the world. Next to Renee is Patrick Walker, who is the director of media partnerships at Facebook. He leads content partnerships with media companies across news, sport, and entertainment. Next to Patrick is Janine Gibson, editor-in-chief at BuzzFeed UK, a post that she's held for the last 2 years, really changing the culture and the shape of BuzzFeed journalism during that period. She spent 17 years at The Guardian before that, including launch editor of Media Guardian. Finally, James Harding, the man who upsets the left and the right in equal measures, therefore doing his job at the BBC, where he leads journalism with an audience, a global audience of about 300 million, right? You've embraced the distribution of content on platforms with, I think you're now one of the largest news providers on Facebook, many millions of followers of BBC content on Twitter as well. So it'll be interesting to hear your views on platforms. But before that, let's just talk about the kind of macro view, and sort of gauge the mood of the panel about relative optimism or pessimism for the news industry. Janine, can I ask you first, are you a buyer or a seller?
Oh, God. Well, I do always feel optimistic. Because just at the moment, usually when we plummet into despair, something else comes along, and we realise that people are terrifically engaged in what we do as a whole. It may never be universally positive for any individual one of us at any given time, and you know, James will know that feeling very well. But as a whole, you know, when you look at the engagement of, say, under 35s, which is a group I'm particularly interested in, I think 5 years ago we might have said we'll never get under 35s interested in news. It's done. Mainstream media brands cannot engage with them at all. There's no reaching them. And that's clearly not true. Not only are they massively engaged with sites such as ours, but you know, they're starting to pay for other types of media in the United States. This generation has become kind of fully engaged, quite passionate, and you know, engaging with politics at Glastonbury. So I try not to be too depressed by any individual stat, even though Nick tries on an annual basis to bring us all down. And I will be Susie Sunshine today and say it won't be that bad. Give it a couple of months.
Renee, your perch at the FT, buyer or seller of media, do you also see the same trends with the under 35s and news consumption?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to be optimistic, and I'm actually going to go ahead and say I am optimistic. I think there's a lot of good in the catastrophism. So the idea that fake news is part of the conversation means that news is part of the conversation. The idea that the under 35s are beginning to pay for content in general, even if it's streaming music or Netflix, means that they're paying for content. You know, the fact that there's an assault on this of news, and you know, in this conversation around trust, means that actually there's more than ever a value on real news in the ecosystem, just as a social good. We've never been more valuable and relevant actually. So, I mean, yeah, I actually think it's a context in which it won't be easy. Give it a couple months. But there is, I think, a shift in the perception of a need for news that certainly wasn't probably the case just pre-Trump or pre-Brexit.
And do you see that, James, that the need, the usage has moved over the last year? Obviously, we've seen in the US, the Journal and the New York Times really benefiting from that in terms of subscriptions. But in usage terms, have you seen that at the BBC?
So I think, firstly, Nick, thank you very much. It's a brilliant piece of work. And actually, I've got to say, I think by Nick's standards, it's actually quite optimistic. Yeah. So I think we should be pretty cheerful. You won't be surprised, I'll give a BBC answer. I'm on both sides of the argument on the buyer and seller. The buyer, for this reason, is that if you stand back from everything that's in the report, what's really interesting to me over time is that the divisions in the media, whether it's the news is more for old people than it is for young people, or broadcast versus print, or publicly funded versus, privately subscription or advertising funded. Actually, the really stark distinction this year is between quality and junk. Yeah. Right? And actually, that makes me really optimistic, because I think everyone in this room would say it's quite an exciting moment when the market is driving you to quality, and that quality is being rewarded, and those people who are not delivering on quality, and that is, as you said at the beginning, Ed, about not just what happened, but what it means, about investigations and original distinctive journalism, all of that's being rewarded, and rewarded, on all forms of media. Where I'm on the other side is around the areas that Nick pointed to on polarization. And it's easy to think that if the BBC is getting knocked by the left and not by the right, that sort of something is going right. I think it's slightly more complicated and more difficult than that, and probably more enduring, is because what I think we're seeing, both in the US and the UK, and you may argue within other democracies too, is that you're seeing not just polarization between the parties, but you are seeing polarization within the parties. And as I think a lot of us know, arguments within families are often more heartfelt than arguments between families. And what you're seeing as a result of that is people who feel as though the broad position of the right is made, but not their position, or the broad position of the left is made, but not theirs. And that, I think, is going to be quite a strong feature of the political landscape and the arguments around news.
Well, I'd like to come on to this point about polarisation and what the potential end state is, maybe later on in the discussion. But Patrick, you had media partnerships at Facebook, and last time I looked, Facebook had some reach. Are you a buyer or a seller of media and journalism?
Well, first of all, thanks for a great piece of work. It's interesting, and for us, we see this as a new baseline in many ways. We've seen this report. We've studied it every year, and in the past year, more than ever, we've made a real concerted effort to engage more deeply with the news industry, to work on initiatives for news integrity, or even within schools. And now it might or might not move the needle, but we're excited to see next year's report to see if the collaborative work we're doing with the industry is actually making a difference. The things that stand out for me really is the lack of trust, which I think goes well beyond social. And together, I think it's an alarm bell that we need to think carefully about how we can work together to address it. The areas that I was encouraged by and quite excited by is that this is an industry in rapid transformation. There's nothing fixed. It's all moving, from young people willing to pay for news to a massive shift towards messaging apps for news access, which in many ways is even remarkable for us. That the diversity of access points in different countries as well. I think that's fascinating, and that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. We have to really work market by market with partners to find meaningful solutions. And that's something that we found actually this year with the Facebook Journalism Project, is that in a room of 20 different partners or 30 different partners, you may have some common threads like more revenue, more trust, more attribution. These are things that we're working on. But if you break down the conversations to individual partners like the FT, or somebody who's more ad-supported, who's somebody who's based on branded content initiatives, we have to find solutions that work for all of them. it's important for us to recognize that as people put more trust in our products, we need to put more revenue into the pockets of the partners that work with us. And so that's something that really stands out for us that we need to take seriously.
So I'll take you as a whole then. rather than by myself.
I mean, we are optimistic about this is interesting actually, because it ties into our upgrade, if you like, or the evolution of our mission statement. I don't know if you've seen this recently. Mark put out a 5,700 words letter where he outlined some of our thinking and the angst, I think, that we felt as a company that just connecting the world doesn't necessarily make it a better place. And that's something that I think we've all felt. And just the other day, there was a change to the mission statement that it said it's more now, we want to focus on giving people the power to build community and bring the world closer together, which I think resonates when you look at that slide that shows this polarization, that just connecting people isn't enough. Finding ways to empower news organizations, individuals to connect with one another, not just within their own sphere of political thought, but also between those areas of thinking. So it's inspired us to look at new products that we can talk about. But we think now, this year for us, is going to be about positivity and trying to use these tools for good, which is it's a concerted effort on our part.
Do others on the panel think we need to change the record about Facebook and Google, that we, I used the statistic in my opening remarks about 90% of incremental digital revenue going to those two companies. Do we think it's now time to actually figure out how we can more constructively work with them rather than just kind of throw bricks? What do you think, Renee?
I think we don't have any choice, which is never an entirely pleasant place to be in. But I think that kind of constraint can be very positive for innovation. So it means that as the models evolve and as the market evolves, so increasingly all of us, whether we're a paid content brand or a public brand or digital pure player, we all rely on these platforms for referral traffic increasingly. Only more people, only more audiences will be coming from those places. The brands will only become more disintermediated. There's less and less direct traffic. So there's a reality of this kind of a new distribution world in which we have to be partners. There's also a reality in which, for the business model that increasingly the platforms are owning when it comes to advertising, they need content. And we produce content. And increasingly, I think we are seeing the needle shift towards a premium on quality content as the differentiation becomes clear, right? Like between crap content and the content that real news media produce. So the pressure from the public and the pressure from the market, and I think the industry, theoretically ought to be pushing us towards more collaboration. And I think the hating on the platforms was very last year to some extent. And I think that the conversation this year is a little bit more about saying, okay, we have a collective set of problems, quite different from the platform perspective and from the media perspective, but we probably should solve them together. And I think we're inching towards that way.
Do you think, Janine, we're past peak hating then of the platforms?
Okay, so here's my problem. I don't think this is just about Facebook and Google. I think when we talk about polarization in the media, we are talking about an issue which is about representation without judgment. And that has slightly come out of a platform issue, which is if I share it with you, it rises up regardless of whether it's true. Sometimes it happens on the BBC. This is not just about Facebook and Google. We have all watched programmes where somebody from the left and somebody from the right are sat down to have a debate. Some of us have been on those programmes, and you're asked before you go on where you are on this. You go, I don't know, sort of thought we'd talk about what had happened. And those views must be represented. When you see a graph that has the canary at one end and Breitbart at the other, that's entitled News in the United Kingdom, I mean, that isn't the same. It isn't right to put that on a graph with what the BBC does or what we do or what the FT does. That isn't correct. We spent a lot of time over the election tracking the rise of sites where, the cliche is a bloke and an attic. These are literally a bloke and an attic taking something and then spinning it out into something that speaks to something you want to share. But it's not news, it's not true. And this is something I think that we ought to be profoundly concerned about, that it is not about blaming a social network. It's about saying if we gravitate to the extremes of the graph in order to represent something, but we don't apply judgment that says, but that isn't true, then you end up with a guy as President of the United States who tweets bullshit.
Yes.
Because it's taken journalism in the United States sort of 2 years to catch on to the fact that they need to do a headline that goes, President claims incorrectly. You know, President lies in assertion. And I obviously feel quite strongly about this, but I think it's really important that we don't pretend this is all the same. It's not the same. Excuse me. Oh my God, I feel so passionately, I've run out of breath. But it is reductive to blame it on the social networks. It isn't. We all do it.
Did you have the same fears, James, that actually some the people in the attics are, in the end, having a profound impact on the trust of, mainstream, balanced, plural media?
So firstly, I completely buy Janine's point about there are things at play here, beyond obviously the social media platforms. And in fact, I'm reminded when Janine says, you're asked on a BBC show, which side are you on? My favourite was a very famous journalist, in fact, who when asked said, well, which side would you like? So it tells you a little about news. I think we're not beyond peak frustration with the social media platforms, if we're serious about it. And the reason is that I don't think it's working, and the relationship is working, and it's not working for Facebook or Google, and it's not working increasingly for the advertising companies, and it's not necessarily working for the news media businesses too. And while I think you probably have seen, and Patrick's been a big part of this, and actually a lot of us in this room have been involved in really concerted efforts to engage in really constructive discussions about what we do, the truth is it's just not moving fast enough for the changes. And whilst I don't think it's working for Facebook and Google, is if you look at the perception, we, or most of us in this room, grew up with the view that rightly these are companies and organisations that have hugely transformed our lives for the better. Individually, our lives are much richer and more interesting for the services they provide. And yet in the last few years, if you're working on the public affairs side in Facebook or in Google or to a certain extent Amazon and Apple for that matter, you're suddenly on the end of these issues around hate speech and terrorism, around child sex grooming and pornography, around impact on labour markets and tax. And now there's this big issue around fake news. And fake news, I think, is a quite blunt phrase which actually probably misdiagnoses the problem. But what it fundamentally says is, what is the role of these platforms in distributing quality information? And I think the reason why it's much more difficult, the reason I don't think we're past peak frustration, is that as well as the problems that have hit the economic models of news organisations of all kinds, there's now an increasing problem, as Nick recognises, of attribution, that people are looking at Facebook, Google and others and not recognising the brand of news. I think that's a big issue. And there's an advertising issue that you've seen advertising companies increasingly concerned about the way in which the system works. And when, and I sort of feel for Patrick, because you're trying to carry a big organisation with a lot of conflicting demands. But on this, one of the key areas is the sharing of data. And the sharing of data that organisations like mine keep asking for keeps being 2 steps behind what we think we really need.
But that issue of trust, I'm very interested, just to stay with you, James, for a second. The panel will have views on this as well. With Grenfell, it was the first time I've seen on broadcast channels the mainstream media heckled by the public, and heckled in a really, really strong way. We saw, not just Channel 4 News, not just Jon Snow, across the board. And I just wonder what's happening, how you would explain that phenomenon where you've got, essentially members of the public feeling this level of frustration that they shout at journalists now when they're on the scene.
Well, many of us, live quite near Grenfell Tower and sort of saw what happened. Actually, if I can say, I think that one thing that's been amazing about the public protest, given the pain and shock and fury, is actually how restrained and disciplined it's been. I mean, we were carrying those pictures as that crowd of demonstrators moved to Kensington and Chelsea Council, and actually what was really striking was the calls that were made by people there to say we must make sure that our protest is heard and it's not in any way marred by violence. And so I actually think, you know, a bit of heckling, right, is a pretty understandable emotional response. So I don't read too much into that. I do think, though, that what you are seeing, and let's take the Grenfell Tower case, what's really, really striking is that, you know, through the course of the night, obviously it became very clear very quickly that something horrific had happened. And then there was this gap between what the authorities were saying, by which I mean police, fire brigade, you know, government, as the official line on what had happened, and what was the understanding on the ground. And if you remember, on that first day, people were reporting that 6 people had died. And one of the things that we were struggling with as we were broadcasting at the top of our bulletins was making clear to listeners and viewers that this number was much, much higher. And even today, when we look at it, you know, yesterday in a news conference, we were sitting discussing, saying the latest police number remains 79. Are we confident in that? How does that match up? And I think that what has, and this is partly about the sort of shocking nature of what happened at Grenfell Tower, but of course it's also about how do you report responsibly? How do you deliver on that requirement to be accurate and to only report what you know, and then tell audiences, look, this is the scale of what we don't know, right? And that's what we kept trying to say is, look, these are the numbers of people who are missing. This is who we think. This is what we don't know. But it's understandable that when that gap about what you don't know is really large, that the nature of social media is that large numbers of people can fill it, and fill it also with what they don't know. And I don't think there's a remedy to it, and I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think it actually gives room for people to voice their feelings about what they're seeing and hearing, and is actually quite instructive, you know, in terms of the way in which the media thinks about itself. So I actually think there's something about that social media that works as, if you like, you know, a giant fact-checking machine, you know, that checks us. But you're right to call it out, because I think it's a really significant.
Janine, were you surprised by the kind of mainstreaming of the conspiracy around the d-notice and the death toll?
I wasn't in the slightest surprised, because I'm afraid over the last, certainly over the last month, but actually over the last few years, BuzzFeed, as a global news organisation, has spent an enormous amount of time getting very, very good at debunking.
Yeah.
And almost the first thing we do, and tragically in the UK over the last month we've got really good at this, is start a post that says, here's all the stuff that is untrue about this unfolding news situation. It's usually our most shared thing. Because, and I only realised this with Grenfell, fake news is quicker than real news. Of course it is. Fake news is a lot easier and faster and quicker to spread. It takes time to verify true things. It takes time to verify 6 or 20 or 79 casualties. It takes no time at all to go, my friend is missing, please text me. And you cannot believe your repugnance that somebody would do this. Fights against it. So we do that first, and we are, I don't know, every week brings fresh horror in what human nature will do. But I think it's really valuable, and it's clearly shared, and that then extends into D-notice conspiracies, or we now have a new form of headline, which is no, comma. X, Y, and Z has not just happened. So, you know, that is a form of trust. And those things are hugely shared. So brackets, I dispute that BuzzFeed is not trusted. However, I do think this comes back to a sense that if we put 2 sets of facts, and I think the roots of it do come from Brexit. I think the roots of it do come, in this country, come from last year. If we put 2 sets of facts, we put your facts and your facts on a stage and have a big argument, then somehow that is reporting the news. That isn't reporting the news. There aren't 2 sets of facts, and if we haven't found out what the fact is, then we haven't done our job properly.
So Patrick, tell us a little bit about how Facebook then is grappling with this issue, when, you know, what we're talking about in Grenfell, these are not disputed facts. There are facts and there are untruths whereas that's obviously very different to, as you point out, James, differences of opinion or point of view on why something has happened. But tell me a little bit about the intention of Facebook around trying to tackle this, so that perhaps you at least decelerate the speed in which fake news is shared.
Well, there are a couple things, and we use the word false news because I think, as it was stated, the word fake news has been sort of appropriated for political purposes, and it's a very wide spectrum. But the thing that, first of all, that we really focused on was the financially motivated spam, the clickbait, and that's something that we can do technologically. We can do through checking the sources. We didn't do it enough prior to the U.S. election, and we put a lot of resource into this. And this is the stuff that you don't see under the surface, but it's working more effectively than ever, so that we don't have things like a spoof site coming up with no history. And if things like that start to spread, then we have ability to deprecate it or remove it altogether, and penalties for those who create it. The other thing that we're focused on is really, and it's still a lot of work to be done, obviously, is more attribution, so that the quality does rise, and making sure that we also provide, I think, importantly, a diversity points of view. We did do some tests with third-party fact checkers in the US and France and the Netherlands, and they did give us some interesting results. One thing that we did find, however, is that when people are just confronted with something that says disputed, it isn't necessarily as effective as some other trials that we did, which showed people the diversity of points of view. For example, in the French elections, if you're reading a story about Macron, you could see there what are the policies of Mélenchon and Le Pen and others, to give people a broader perspective without being judgmental or telling them that they're wrong or what they're looking at is incorrect. So that's something that we're going to be doing more of, is information diversity. And I was very pleased with the report to see that actually using social doesn't necessarily create this filter bubble that was often discussed, but actually those people are actually looking at multiple sources and strengthening the weak ties. And the last area I referenced at the beginning, which is really about, we had a public service announcement that went across a multitude of different countries and different languages, just helping inform people how to be better digital citizens and identify things that might be untrue, and to be more thoughtful. And I think that's something that we need to do more of. That's a long-term play. All these things together, I hope will make a dent, and that we'll see numbers next year that show a difference. But
how big an issue is it now with the sort of top echelons of Facebook? Because you've been
well, I mean, it's a very big
acting
issue.
too slowly on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the initial response was seen as being perhaps too dismissive, even though we took it very, very seriously. And so I think you might have noticed some dramatic changes in not just how we speak about it, but what we're doing and the level of engagement that we have. I was actually just speaking in Berlin yesterday in a similar sort of panel, and they have an election coming up, and I asked the question, how many people in this room think that false news is a big issue? And maybe 12 out of a room of 200 put their hands up. So the perception is also different in different markets, and it's oftentimes after the fact of something happening that, if it didn't go the way you thought it was going to go, all of a sudden it becomes an issue. So we have to be mindful of how it's perceived. But the fact is, trust is low, not just with social, but with news generally. The fact is, people need to be better informed. People need a diversity of opinion, but we need to do it in a way that works for them, because just confronting them with an opposing fact is not working at all.
Look, I think what we'll do now is turn to questions in the audience. So, do you know what? I'm going to actually ask Katie Vanek-Smith first. The lady who was on the panel last year from Dow Jones, who I think, if my memory is right, stimulated quite a noisy argument. So I'm hoping your question will be along those lines. So, Katie.
Thanks to everyone. Actually, I'm going to come straight to Patrick.
Oh, great.
Didn't
expect that.
You didn't at all, did you? Actually, the thing that I wanted to comment on was actually, I agree with the optimism, but if I take a negative away, for me, it's about brand recall.
Yeah.
And if you think about the importance of brand recall for the link to making money, be that a subscription model or advertising, so reach, relevance, relationships, trust is also got a direct correlation to brands. So we're talking here about trust. So my question really is about Facebook on behalf of many of the distribution platforms. What do you think your role is in helping us build brand recall rather than putting us into ghettos of instant articles?
Mm-hmm. That's actually one of the main work streams in our Facebook journalism project, engagement on product development. How do we better attribute the stories to the sources, It's quite interesting actually, because there's a real diversity of opinion as well, and there are some that say that we should elevate and provide greater visibility to trusted news sources. But when you start having that conversation in markets outside of the UK, the US, France, Italy, Spain, when you start thinking about places like Turkey and Russia and Malaysia, all of a sudden, who makes that list? Where does that come from? If you just big up the officials and you somehow make the individual voices less relevant. So what we're trying to do is make sure that when you do see a story, you have better branding, and that could be through colorization within instant articles. We have lots of different ideas that are coming through our work group that will improve this. And again, I see this report as a benchmark, and hopefully next year we'll see something slightly different. But I think we also have to remember, and it was mentioned in the opening, that there's a weakening of the tie between the creator and the end user. And I think in many ways through social there's a strengthening of that tie if you're not a traditional media organization. If you're Dan Rather, a former news presenter that I grew up with in North America, you actually have a very strong tie now directly with a very large audience of millions for your personal opinion as a former news journalist, which is part of the diversity and the beauty of what we're providing. So we have to find a way to increase the attribution and provide greater relevance. And I would say also even, what's the track record and history of this source? That's another thing that we're looking at.
So what does the 47% recall look like to do? Where would you want that to be next year?
I'm glad it's above search. I think it should be. It's interesting that even people that go directly from, say, the New York Times or directly from the source, it was 85%. So, I would love to see that north of 50% next year and moving even farther as the years go forward. It's a known issue. It doesn't benefit us at all if people think that somehow that story came from just Aunt Betty, and there was no history behind the work and the pedigree of the journalism that supports it. We all win, I think, if people can trust more in the news, clearly, as the data indicates.
Janine, is this an issue you worry about from BuzzFeed's point of view, brand attribution? I'm thinking about, there was a brilliant investigation on Russia, on the state assassinations. Do you feel that your brand, given all the investment you're making in investigative and the more serious end of journalism, do you feel that you're getting good brand attribution for that at the moment, or is the kind of distributed model getting in the way?
Well, what I don't worry about is that our stuff isn't getting read or appreciated, because I see more stats than you can imagine. And our audience is, what is really important to BuzzFeed is being shared. So we really don't care so much about direct traffic. You're very welcome, but what we care is about the under 35s sending something to each other and going, you must read this, because that's the valuable relationship for us. So we monitor, for example, something we call the social lift, which is when I WhatsApp a story to you, or when I tweet it or share it or whatever. So, it's no surprise to us that news being shared by WhatsApp is a massive, we know that, and we measure a metric that is 2.4 rather than 100,000 hits, because our metric is how many people I pass to you and then you pass and so on, because it adds trust. So we know fine well that our stuff is trusted amongst the network of people that share it. It might not register on a big mass market thing in quite the same way. I don't know. I'm not questioning Nick's methodology. But I do think, and this comes back, so I'm not arguing this for BuzzFeed, we're doing all right, cheers. But I do think this issue of representation without judgment is what's destroying people's brand awareness. Mm-hmm. It is incredibly cheap and easy to just write something out and present it and bang it on a feed. It's probably less accurate. It is almost certainly less valuable and less rich. But if it has a headline that makes people feel like it says something they want to say, they will share it. That doesn't make them bad or reckless or irresponsible. It just speaks to them, so they'll share it. And that's something we all need to worry about. We all have to think about how we represent trusted sources. We all have to think about how we share them. And we all have to think about how much prominence we give them, whether it's on airwaves or on networks, because it detracts from everything. There are so many news sites that you wouldn't recognise the names of in this room, that we see every day being represented on things like BuzzSumo. We created a social barometer for the election just to look at what people were sharing. Now, not only were people only sharing things about the Labour Party, they weren't sharing anything about the Conservatives whatsoever. They were only sharing positive things about the Labour Party. The things that they were sharing about the Tories were all negative, so you had to dig into the sentiment as well. And the mainstream news brands were not routinely in the top 5 articles being shared, because it wasn't about the article, it was about the headline. And you have to be looking at this stuff on a weekly basis to be genuinely concerned about it, I think.
Just one thing I will say, you asked about things that we're doing. I think we don't talk that often about things that we're doing that affect the algorithm, what appears in your feed, but we do have this term informedness, and we query people every single day, tens of thousands of people, to see whether something that they clicked on was useful or what they expected. Also, we can tell whether there's dwell time, whether they instantly reject it, and so there are ways that we're actually dealing with what is essentially clickbait. Just like, how many of you used to have lots and lots of spam in your inbox when you're using Hotmail or Yahoo Mail? Would you say today that your inbox is relatively spam-free, but if you go to your spam folder, you see there's so much stuff there. So technology actually does work, and we're applying similar sort of logic to rid the social feed as best we can of these things that are really spammy clickbait. Because a lot of the stuff is, as I said, financially motivated. You go there, and this is this ad farm, and people, even though they click it, doesn't mean that's going to appear in their feed next time around, because we have ways to deal with it.
Other questions from the floor? There's a question here. And then we'll take one over there as well.
Hi, Steve Schiffers. I just wanted to go back to trust in media and perhaps separate a little bit from just social media, because I think the figure Nick's showing, 40% trust in media, is really pretty low. And if we look at a trend, that trend predates social media. I mean, we've had falling trust in mainstream media since 2000s, and it's parallel to falling trust in other institutions, particularly in politics. So I think there's a deeper question here about some of the mainstream institutions and how they relate to increasingly perhaps alienated populations. So it's not just Brexit where there's this division, but Brexit really made the polarization argument much clearer in Britain the way it hadn't been before, but also just the sense that the population as a whole is less enamored, as it were, of the establishment, and that there's this growing polarization and weakening of mainstream institutions. So I think there's a question for how media should respond to that, not just how they should respond to fake social news, but how they can contribute to perhaps either reducing the political polarization or creating those platforms where kind of there's a political communication that can go on, and which the BBC classically has been seen as the site where that happens in the UK. But again, as James is saying, perhaps that's also under pressure.
Renee, have you seen that in the FT?
Yeah, sort of. I want to say two things. The question of the polarization, I mean, it's fascinating to see these findings and see especially the difference in findings between countries. But it's not so much a polarized media, although it is that too, but a perception of polarization, which in some ways is much more complicated, right? And that speaks directly to what I think is the opportunity in this. And this may be my American side finding opportunity and challenge as opposed to irresolvable problem. But if trust is a challenge, then we need to be kind of figuring out, both commercially, but even more important editorially, how can we be relevant? How can we actually create a relationship that is meaningful to our audience? And we have dramatically different audiences on stage, right? And we ultimately are trying to build a relationship with all of our audiences, which is why the lack of brand recognition and perception on Facebook is really complicated and ought to be much better, especially because it is related to trust. And there's a lot more that Facebook could be doing to help us create this relationship. But it comes down to actually just basically, are we providing for the audience what they're looking for? Are we relevant? Are we answering the questions that need to be answered? Are we fulfilling a need? I think a lot of media, a lot of news media, especially traditional legacy brands, aren't in the habit or the culture of thinking themselves as a service, especially paid for media like my own, but that's what we're in. And I think if you're fulfilling a need that actually responds to some kind of utility, aside from the greater social utility of really good journalism, then you're building a relationship that actually leads to trust. And that's where we do need help from the platforms in creating something that resembles the relationship off-site that we want to be having on-site. And unlike Janine, I do want people to be coming back to my site, thank you very much. And I do need Facebook to be helping create some kind of relationship off-site that's a proxy for what we do much better on-site, because that is actually part of the greater social good that is trust in journalism, and which has to be happening on the platforms for better or for worse.
Could you, James, jump in?
Just a quick point. I think you're absolutely right to say that there's some deeper issues here, and they really are worth thinking about. One thing on the technology front that I think is probably creeping up on us, and I suspect we'll be talking about even more next year. We talk a lot about fake news. I think we're not properly thinking enough about bots and the impact of bots on essentially the perversion of perception, the extent to which you think you're reading something, you think there's a volume of interest in it, but actually bots are driving that perception. That's going to accelerate something which is a technology issue. Underlying it, there's a really big human one. So just from the BBC's point of view, we see a world in which two things are true. Actually, you're seeing the BBC continue to have by far the highest trust ratings of any news media. You see on the day after the general election, 25 million people come to BBC News Online, as Nick says. You see people come there for accuracy and reliability. So on the one hand, you continue to see that. The other thing that you also see, though, is more and more people complaining that the BBC and other broadcast media, and in fact other news media, are biased in one form or another. So what's going on there? I think that this is, I mentioned polarisation and the facets of polarisation. There's also issues about identity and community. And how are you reporting as a news organisation? Identity and identity politics is a really big issue. And how are you getting close to communities? And this may be geographic communities or not. I think these things also lead to a sense of exclusion by the media, and that then feeds an absence of trust. So one of the things we spend a lot of time thinking about is precisely that, actually the very physical business of how we're doing in terms of serving different communities in the UK and obviously around the world. But I think you're completely right to acknowledge the scale of it and also the complexity of it.
I'm going to take a question here.
Thank you, Jonathan Hayward. I sort of have a kind of confession. You know, my name's Jonathan. I'm a regulator. I run Impress, the independent regulator. And you know, in the media, we have a really bad relationship with regulation, particularly in the print media, and to some extent that's bled across into digital news media. But you know, if we just take out the word regulation or regulator, which is one of my least favourite things about Impress, which every other respect I'm really proud of what we've achieved. And actually, if we think about it, what we're looking at here is a situation where the public are really clear about what they expect from journalism. And that hasn't really wavered. We've done lots of research on this over the years, and so have others. They want people who report on the facts. It came through in Nick's findings. It's come through over many years. And they're not getting that, or they don't believe they're getting that. There's a mismatch between expectation and reality, or the perception of reality. And that's the trust problem. It's not astrophysics. It's kind of fairly simple. And if we take out the word regulation and think, well, okay, what is it that we can use to drive a sense of accountability, to reassure the public that facts are facts, that even if our slant on those facts may not chime with theirs, nonetheless the underlying facts are the facts. And perhaps to sort of get out of this mindset of sort of trust us, we're journalists, which I think some in the press still have, and to say actually trust us because we're prepared to be held accountable. Forget Impress, forget Ipso, forget Ofcom, forget the actual names, but just think that basic idea of regulation as a critical friend to journalism, is that not at least part of the solution? And bearing in mind the fact that actually the BBC and other broadcasters in this country do enjoy higher trust than the print and digital media, and as it happens, they are independently and effectively regulated.
It applies to the platforms as well, though.
Sorry?
It also applies to platforms as well, though.
Well, I mean, the question of platform regulation is an incredibly complex one. We can talk more about it, but it's what exactly are you regulating there?
That's
are you
an
regulating
interesting
the
point you
user
raised,
or the platform?
Renee, which is actually in looking at this issue, separating off journalists from distributors and platforms might not necessarily be the smart thing in the future, that we need to look at this in the round, right?
Well, collectively, there's a merging, at least from perception. I think you quite rightly point out this is a question of perception, right? And there's a perception that as me as a user, as a consumer of news media, am somehow not getting what I want, and I know what I want. Collectively, distribution is no longer something that any news media or brand owns, and if indeed, you know, consumption of news is part of a greater public good, and this is increasingly part of the mechanisms that drive the business models of the platforms, there's a question to be asked around actually how do we resolve this for the collective good?
But I think, I mean, Jonathan, as you'll know very well, this issue about regulation and freedom of expression, right? This is a noble argument that we've been having in this country for a fair few hundred years, goes back to John Wilkes, and it's not an easy one to resolve. And I think there's a danger that, as is often the case with things in the media, that we all latch on to one particular thing. In this year, it's been fake news, and we see everything through that prism. And you know, the issue here is that we talk about facts, right? But actually everyone, and I can see many, you know, colleagues and competitors in this room, we all know the world's more complicated than facts. I'll give you a simple example. We've had a service called Reality Check, right? Where we try and essentially say, when a politician stands up and says something, is it true? And we've run it through previous elections. About a year or so ago, we made it permanent. We made it a permanent feature of what the BBC does. And as you may have seen in the last election, Steph McGovern was on air every week saying, we're going to reality check X assertion or Y. And when we were doing it, you know, one of the things that we were looking at online was, how do we illustrate it? What would be a good way that you could say, either, is it true, or is it some version of very much not, right? And we, of course, thought about lots of fun things, you know, pants on fire and long noses and all of that stuff, right? And then we realized the world's not that simple, right? It's not as easy to grade how true or untrue it is. And I think that the issues around trust in the media, around facts, are actually getting resolved by the market. That's my point at the beginning, is that quality is actually getting more and more heavily prized. One of the issues around regulation, of course, is the behavior of the media beyond just that issue about facts. And trust obviously involves a great deal more than that, and the nature of the, you know, the behavior of the media. So I just think, I think that trying to regulate facts is a really, I find myself on the free expression end of that argument, because I think it's much more complicated than trying to assert which facts are necessarily right, because there are some things that are plainly true, there are some things that are plainly not, and there are some things that we can argue about.
Any other comments on the Patrick?
I agree with you on that one.
Janine?
I have one insight, which is, having launched many, many, many fact-checking operations, nobody wants to read a reality check. They're just really boring. So
No, hang on, no, that's our fault. Just so we're clear about these things, right? There's certain things we've got to be really careful about. So we have a brand attribution problem, completely right, and this has crept up on us in the last year. And we've got to have an argument with Facebook, and Facebook has got to get in there to sort of think its way into our shoes about that issue about brands. But we also have a responsibility to say, actually, how do we do what Coca-Cola does so that you always know what the product is? And likewise with reality check and facts, you know, one of the things is that fact-checking sites are often much more boring, right, than, you know, fake news operations. Well, it's our job to make those fact-checking operations grabby. And the reason we changed what we did with reality check, and the reason we asked Steph, who's incidentally excellent, to go on the 10 o'clock news and say, let's explain, you know, tax on the 10 o'clock news, is we thought we can make this look like a really good piece of TV, which happily she did. So I think there's I'm sort of wary of that, Janine, because I think otherwise we say, oh look, we can't do this in an interesting way. And heaven knows, you know, we've spent a few years between us trying to tell boring stories in interesting ways.
No, what I meant was you can't put a, and obviously I meant nothing against Steph, who is fascinating.
I know you didn't, I know, which is a free
Still
plug.
really early. What I meant was you can't separate out all the facts from the rest of your journalism and go, come over here and read the bibliography of fact, because nobody's going to do that. And I have a sort of similar issue with kind of top-line regulation, which is there's no point being very concerned about the overall span of what you do. Every single thing you do has to have its own integrity, because disaggregation, because sharing, because Patrick is not going to put a special badge on it and say, this is the true one, although perhaps he should. Yeah. So you just can't ever let your guard down. And, you know, I have been working in media long enough that I remember the introduction of the Reader's Editor and how this was going to transform our trust in newspapers, or various TV news regulation initiatives that were going to transform trust in TV news. And when it comes down to it, the one thing that we did in digital journalism was show our working. We've sort of became known for that as live blogging started at The Guardian, when we started talking about unpicking the pyramid of how you do a news story, what we said was, say what you don't know, say what you know. And as live blogging has become better and telling digital news stories become better, we put, every BuzzFeed breaking post that shows what's happening and the developing situation has sometimes 20 bullet points at the top with, here is what we know right now. We edit the bullet points more often than we change the post. We continually focus on, this is what we know right now. And I don't think people necessarily register that when they're talking about trust or fake news or whatever, but I think they do understand it when they see it. It's certainly the most shared thing we do, the bullet point of what is happening right now and what we know to be true.
So look, it's coming up to 10 o'clock. Sort of final question from me around predictions. So what's going to be in Nick's report next year? Now, in my opening remarks, I gave you a long list of stuff, frankly, events that really very few of us predicted. So you're very welcome to be quite outlandish rather than incremental change. And some of you might disagree with Janine that Patrick is going to introduce a special badge. We'll see. Renee, what are we going to see in the next year in this space?
That's a good question. If I look quickly at my crystal ball, in the 2 seconds that it took you to ask the question, I would say probably two things. One, I think, is I think the advantage of one of the sort of general calling into question of things is a refocusing on what we can do. And I think what we can do as publishers is, it's just as Janine was saying, it's basically figuring out, what do people really want? What do they really need? And is it the thing that we were doing before? Maybe, maybe not. And if it's not, we need to start doing it now. It's clarity, it's explanation, it is creating signals within the noise, because if anything is the problem, if anything is creating mistrust, it's this massive amount of noise. So it's a very abstract way of saying I think we all need to be more focused on filling the need of an audience and owning that relationship. And I think we're beginning increasingly to realize as publishers that we don't need the platforms quite as much. We do need them, but there's a kind of rebalancing of just how much we need them, what we need them for. So it's going to be focusing on our content, number one, and predictive in terms of actually like what's going to happen in terms of novelty. I do think actually messaging apps, and whether it's Messenger or WhatsApp or Telegram in Spain are really going to become a way in which precisely brands are going to be able to own their attribution much more closely and really want to develop that one-to-one relationship of distribution. That's my prediction for 2018.
James, do you want to have a go?
Oh, really? Yeah. All right, I think a few sort of separate things. So I mentioned bots. I think that we'll be talking about a fair bit. I think we haven't talked probably enough today, but I think that voice and different plays on Alexa and the like will be a big issue. Obviously, we're a big radio business. We care a lot about that. I think that cybersecurity in the media, as we get more and more digital relationships with our audiences and customers, we're going to be engaged much more directly in that. So I think that will be an issue. I happen to think that more and more there is going to be an issue about the nature of the author, right? Because we're going to move into a world where you're going to see more political manipulation of media. You're going to see more direct corporate content. You're going to therefore also want to know more about the nature of the author, the journalist, and the individual. So I think that will be a theme in your head.
Patrick, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, I always like to say I'd rather be an optimist and be wrong than a pessimist and be right. And actually, we're doing a lot to tip the scales, I think, in favor of, I would say, people feeling more connected to the news sources through lots of different tools. And that's not just through social and Facebook, but I would expect that to emerge even greater on social messaging applications, where you do have that feeling of a direct relationship through Messenger bots or WhatsApp or the diversity of other ones that exist. I think that's going to be an interesting trend to watch. I'm also really interested to watch a shift in the diversity of revenue sources, which you see starting to change in this report, say prior to the last report. an increase in branded content opportunities. As you see, even traditional media organizations now investing heavily in these teams and the tools improving as well. I think we'll continue to see a rise in subscription. That's both a trend that we're seeing generally, but also through tools that we personally are looking to improve on behalf of many of our partners who've asked for this. I'm not sure that overall trust will improve just because of the general political climate, but I think it's all something that we should work on together to change, because if we can't get that right as an industry over the next few years, then we'll be in deeper trouble.
Before we come to you, Janine, Katie, do you think we're going to get the brand attribution that Patrick promised, above 50%?
Only at 3%.
I'll do a stretch goal of 60.
You want 5%?
Minimum.
Right, well,
we should aim for the stars.
No, I aim much higher.
He said 60, right?
I'll do a stretch goal of 60.
He said 60, okay, 60.
Play back the tape.
Right, we'll
We'll make a bet.
We'll come back
to have a
next
forfeit
year.
if I don't hit it.
Janine, take us home then.
I'm going to return to my earlier optimism. It's going to be a fantastic year for news. We are going to see engagement with news and audiences for news continue to grow to hitherto unimaginable levels, which again, 5-8 years ago, we would not have thought that was a thing. We should be hugely pleased about that. That will also mean many more providers of news, and that will provide us with challenges, and Patrick is going to introduce a special badge, and my fortune will be made.
So with that, Nick, optimism from the panel. Let's see what you turn up next year. So listen, thanks very much to you and to David for this brilliant lecture. And to the panel. Thank you.